As we saw in the last session, Dr. Elaine Pagels, a noted scholar of the New Testament and early Christianities, discovered a pattern in John's prologue that she calls the Three Negations. In verse 5, the light shined in the darkness, but the darkness didn't understand it. He was in the world, in verse 10, yet the world did not know him. Verse 11, he came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. So the light was there, and it's been here since the beginning, but the light was not understood, known, or accepted. Until verse 14, and the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son. So John's whole point, according to this pattern, is that Jesus' incarnation changed everything. Jesus coming among us changed the whole order of creation, so that God's glory is the light, in the light, could be seen, understood, known, and accepted. But Dr. Pagels hypothesizes something else too. She and many other scholars think that John wasn't just making a random theological point, but that John was directly refuting another set of theological claims about Jesus that were popular around his time. These rival claims really came into focus in 1945 when a library of ancient documents was discovered in a place called Egypt called Nag Hamadi. And so it's to Nag Hamadi and these rival theological claims where we turn next. In 1945, an Egyptian peasant named Muhammad Ali, no, not that Muhammad Ali, this Muhammad Ali, he stumbled onto one of the most incredible archaeological discoveries of the last century. He and several other camel herders were at the base of a cliff digging for fertilizer. While digging, they ended up quite by accident coming upon a huge earthenware jar about 6 feet high, just there buried in the ground. He broke the jar open, hoping to find gold. He thought he and his friends were in the money. But alas, it was just pieces of papyrus found in little books. Disappointed, they divided the books amongst themselves, even tearing some of the books apart so as to make each of the camel herders go away with an equal pile of papyrus. Some of the herders took the books home and burned them as fuel, thinking them to be completely worthless. Muhammad Ali took them home and dumped them out on his little dirt patio, allowing his wife to figure out how best to use them around the house. Nearby to Nag Hamadi, there had been, many centuries before, an ancient monastery. So the prevailing theory seems to be that this clay jar was a part of the library of that ancient monastery. In the early 4th century, there was an edict from Bishop Athanasius, the real hero of the Nicene Council. He said that there were heretical and dangerous books out there which were corrupting people's minds as to who Jesus was and is. Athanasius listed the books of the New Testament. His list is one of the earliest lists of the New Testament books, and told his people to beware of anything else. Scholars think that the monks of Nag Hamadi Monastery found themselves in possession of some of these unauthorized texts, but instead of burning them, they buried them. And they laid under the Egyptian sand for over 1,600 years until Muhammad and his friends happened upon them. The Nag Hamadi Library is made up of dozens of texts, some of which we only have portions of because the other bits were burned. Some of the most known texts from this library are the Apocryphon of James, the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Philip, and the Apocalypse of Adam, the Trimorphic Protonoia, which, to be honest, is just fun to say, and the most famous book of the library, the Gospel of Thomas. Most of the library has been categorized as Gnostic, We know from many, many sources that Gnostic Christianity was a real movement in the first several centuries of Christianity. And the heroes of the ancient church were always trying to tamp down Gnosticism. We could spend an entire course studying Gnosticism, but briefly, the Greek word gnosis means knowledge, and Gnosticism presupposed that there was secret knowledge out there that offered salvation to all who knew it. Gnostic Christianity often taught that Jesus had public teachings that everyone and anyone was privy to, but then he also had secret teachings that only a select few were worthy of receiving. Gnostic Christianity claimed to be the vessel that passed down the secret body of Jesus' teachings to future generations. Gnostic writings tend to be, to use a technical term, weird. I mean, really weird. But the Gospel of Thomas, the crown jewel of the Nag Hamadi Library, isn't quite as weird. In fact, there are many parts of it which sound just like Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the Gospel of Thomas also sounds remarkably like a lot of 1st century BC, 1st century AD Hellenistic Judaism. Many scholars looked at the Nag Hamadi Library and immediately assumed they were all very late texts, 2nd, 3rd century works, which were far removed from the New Testament writings. But as scholars keep going back to the Gospel of Thomas, they begin to wonder, is it really all that late? Or could it be a contemporaneous work with the Gospels and the other writings of the New Testament? Elaine Pagels thinks so. In fact, she thinks that there was a group of Christians in the 1st century which had allegiance to Thomas, perhaps to the actual historical Thomas, the actual disciple of Jesus turned apostle, or perhaps they had allegiance to his name and his memory. She calls these Thomasine Christians, and she thinks that John may have written his gospel to refute the claims of Thomasine Christianity. Scholars are clear that John may or may not have ever read the Gospel of Thomas, but he may have heard about it. And because some of the ideas in it aren't unique to Thomas and are found in many other ancient texts, that John may have been refuting a whole group of writers and thinkers and teachers and believers and compelling them to think differently about Jesus. To be very clear, we have absolutely no idea who wrote the Gospel of Thomas. To be honest, there's no reason whatsoever to think that the Apostle Thomas wrote it. Ancient writings were always being written in the name of some famous person. I know you'd never dream of doing something like that today. You'd get sued, but in the ancient world, it happened all the time. So when we say the Gospel of Thomas, we call it that just because that's what it calls itself, not because the Apostle Thomas had anything to do with it whatsoever. Okay, as we've said before, it seems quite clear that John's prologue is a meditation on Genesis, which then becomes a meditation on the absolute centrality of the incarnation of Jesus. But his meditation on Genesis wasn't the only one floating around in those days. In fact, many Hellenistic Jews and even pagan philosophers pored over the creation story in Genesis to find meaning. One of the prevailing ideas about Genesis floating around back then was that when God said, "Let there be light," what was actually going on was God creating the first human. In one ancient writing called the Hypostasis of the Archons, it said that there was a luminous image or an image of light in the heavens above. In another writing called the Writing Without Title, that's its title, The Writing Without Title, it said that humankind was created in the image of the atom of light. The Apocryphon of John repeatedly calls the divine man the light. In the document eugnostos, see the gnosis in there? Eugnostos literally means good knowledge. Eugnostos says that the mortal man is the beginning of light. In the Gospel of Thomas, Thomas talks about the image of light of the Father, which was hidden by the shining light itself. Okay, do you see a pattern here? Image, light, man. Here's the wild thing. This didn't just pop up from nowhere. In first century Judaism, the version of the Old Testament scriptures that was most widely used wasn't the Hebrew version. It was the Greek version, called the Septuagint. In fact, many, many, many times when the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, it's quoting directly from the Greek, not the Hebrew. The version of the scriptures that Jesus was probably most familiar with was the Greek Septuagint. In Genesis 1:3, when God says, "Let there be light," and there was light, the Greek word in the Septuagint for light there is phos. But if you just change the accent above the middle letter, you get another word entirely. It's still phos, but this phos means man. So the thinking is, the ancient texts took advantage of an obvious pun here, so that when God said, "Let there be light," God made light that was also a man of light. Honestly, it would not be a stretch at all to identify this man of light with the Logos. And it appears that John is making a similar claim in his prologue, as he says that this word, this Logos, is the light who is also the man Jesus. So John has a man of light too. But that is where the similarities stop. Thomas and his friends take their meditation on Genesis in a wildly different direction. God created light in Genesis 1:3, which may be some sort of a man of light. But then in Genesis 1:26 and 27, God creates humanity, male and female. What once was a man, singular, now splits into two sexes. For Thomas and most of his friends, this is the problem. Humanity is divided. And what we need to go back to is humanity's original unified state. For Thomas, we need to go back to the beginning. In Thomas, saying 11, we find Jesus say these words, "When you come to dwell in the light, what will you do? On the day when you were one, you became two. But when you became two, what did you do?" Thomas, saying 18, says, "The disciples said to Jesus, 'Tell us how our end will be.' Jesus said, 'Have you discovered then the beginning, that you look for the end? For where the beginning is, there will the end be. Blessed is he who will take his place in the beginning. He will know the end and will not experience death." In saying 22, the disciples asked Jesus, "Shall we then as children enter the kingdom?" Jesus said to them, "When you make the two one, and when you make the inside like the outside, and the outside like the inside, and the above like the below, and when you make the male and the female one and the same, so that the male not be male, nor the female female, and when you fashion eyes in the place of an eye, and a hand in place of a hand, and a foot in a place of a foot, and a likeness in place of a likeness, then will you enter the kingdom." You got that? Totally clear, right? You can see why Thomas didn't quite make it into the New Testament. But the important line there is the first one. When you make the two one. In saying 61, Salome, who is never given a speaking role in the canonical Gospels, says, "Who are you?" And Jesus responds, "I am he who exists from the undivided." There's then a break in the text, maybe one of those bits that got thrown into the oven. But after that broken bit of papyrus, Jesus continues to say to Salome, "Therefore I say, if he is destroyed, he will be filled with light, but if he is divided, he will be filled with darkness." In saying 75, Jesus said, "Many are standing at the door, but it is the solitary who will enter the bridal chamber." So in Thomas, and in many of the other ancient texts, the issue is that we're a divided species, and the goal is to get back to unity. And let's face it, there's a fair degree of misogyny here. One of the basic tenets of Gnosticism is that women are inferior and will never be able to receive the special knowledge that men can. Thomas's gospel doesn't quite come out and say that, but it doesn't do much to dispel that either. The other major theme in the Gospel of Thomas is that while Jesus is the light, you can find the light almost anywhere. Saying 77, Jesus said, "It is I who am the light, which is above them all. It is I who am the all. From me did the all come forth, and unto me did the all extend. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there." However, in saying 3, Jesus says, "The kingdom is inside you, and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known, and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father." Do you see Jesus here pointing not toward himself, but away from himself? He's pointing them to pieces of wood and a stone and even into their own selves. In saying 24, the disciples are begging Jesus to point them in a direction. "Show us the place where you are, since it is necessary for us to seek it." He said to them, "Whoever has ears, let him hear. There is light within a man of light, and he lights up the whole world. If he does not shine, he is in darkness." Jesus had this golden opportunity to say exactly what he says in the Gospel of John. "I am the way, the truth, and the life." But rather than directing them to himself, he directs them to go inside of themselves to find light. In Thomas's Gospel, Jesus has the light within him, but so do you. And all you need to do is search for it and find it within yourself, and you will come to the light, and you will become undivided. I mean, that's kind of different from John's Gospel, right? Any of the Gospels. Now, as we've seen, Thomas is not alone in these ideas, but John's Gospel teaches something that is directly opposite. For John, the whole of cosmic history hinges on the incarnation of Jesus. It's Jesus who is the light. It's Jesus who over and over points to himself as the way, the gate, the shepherd, the resurrection, and the life. Remember the 2 acts in John? The first act is when God said, "Let there be light." And the Logos was introduced into the world, a world that didn't understand, accept, or receive him, until the second act, when the Word became flesh, in Jesus. In Thomas and the other ancient sources, there are also 2 acts. Acts 1 is when the undivided man of light shone forth, and Act 2 is when humanity was split in 2 with the advent of the female side of the species. The rest of Act 2 is about overcoming that condition and recovering our primal, original, masculine, undivided selves. I think this puts the prologue to John in a lot of context. Even if John had never heard of Thomas's Gospel, he certainly would have been aware of the mountain of other texts and teachers who were saying the exact same thing as we find in Thomas's Gospel. And so it appears that not only is John making an argument about what Genesis means and who Jesus is, but he is also quite clearly trying to overturn a set of rival claims about Genesis and Jesus. He's saying that this is true, but he's also saying that this over here, this argument, this message is wrong. We're for this, we're against this. One last little thing. Although we don't really know if John knew of Thomas's gospel, there is just one more little clue in John that he may have very well known of Thomas's gospel, and perhaps even the existence of Thomasine Christians. Because every time that Thomas is mentioned in John's gospel, Thomas is presented as a complete and total dunce. In John 11, Jesus tells the disciples that his friend Lazarus has died. Thomas blurts out the total non sequitur, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." In John 14, Jesus is teaching his disciples that he is going to go and prepare a place for them in his Father's house. Then Jesus says, "You know the way to where I am going." Thomas says, "Lord, we don't know where you're going." And then Thomas is the only disciple who wasn't there when Jesus appeared to the disciples after his resurrection in the upper room. And then he says that he will not believe their account of Jesus rising from the dead unless he receives physical proof. Of course, ever since that story, we've always managed to call Thomas Doubting Thomas. With a nickname like that, it's clear that for the past 2,000 years, Christians haven't missed Thomas's shortcomings, which are laid bare in the Gospel of John. The final nail in the coffin might be what Thomas says next, though. After portraying Thomas in the most clownish of manners, when Jesus does show up again in Thomas's presence, Thomas says, "My Lord and my God." It's the most articulate, exquisite, and profound expression of faith in the whole gospel, maybe even the whole New Testament. So if John was writing his gospel to correct a group of Thomasines who venerated him through his gospel, which bears his name, not only does John make their leader into a fool, he also puts on Thomas's lips the ultimate expression of faith in Jesus as the light of the world.